Hey guys, welcome back to the podcast. Today I'm joined with Olivia Sun. Some of you are familiar with her YouTube channel, talks a lot about social issues, and frames it in a sort of philosophical lens and in sort of a video essay format. It's a really good channel. Really recommend checking it out. Would you like to kind of introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. So, hi, my name's Olivia. As Ben just said, my channel name is Ollie Sun Via, and yeah, I just make video essays. I'm currently based in Toronto, and I'm not very good at consistently posting, but that's okay.
I think for like the first, I've technically had like a channel since 2015, and it wasn't until the pandemic where like I was able to consistently post. It actually is really difficult. Like, don't feel bad about that.
Oh, wow, you've been around for a long time.
Yeah, well, I mean, it only started getting like any sort of growth like in like 2020. I think I had like
Uh,
5 videos on my channel like before that, but I had very like loyal people that just kind of stuck around and waited for me to start posting consistently. But yeah,
oh.
I feel when you say it like that, I feel like old. Like, yeah. This video is sponsored by Babbel. I recently graduated university with a major in psychology and, sadly, a minor in Hispanic studies. Why sadly? Well, despite 3 years immersing myself in Spanish language and literature classes, I haven't really retained much. Now that I have some more time, I really want to get back into it. I do love the Spanish language and would really like to read some of these Spanish books I've purchased. But how do I do it? Thankfully, Babbel exists. These short 10-minute interactive lessons work perfectly to keep my Spanish up. Within 3 weeks of doing these daily, I already noticed that my speaking ability and comprehension improved significantly. Clara me está ayudando con el equipaje. This is probably because these lessons are designed by real language teachers instead of AI or machine learning algorithms used by other language learning apps. Start speaking a new language in 3 weeks with Babbel. Get 65% off your subscription by clicking the link in the description below. I guess just out of curiosity before we begin, what kind of got you into making those YouTube videos?
Yeah, so I think like a lot of people, I was kind of searching for something to do during quarantine. It was 2021. I had just finished my first year of university and I was looking just for something to do. So I was like, okay, are there internships? Are there jobs? Are there volunteer opportunities? And of course, there were none because of COVID. So I don't know. I was just like, what's something like quote unquote productive that I can do with my time? Video essays on YouTube, I guess. And yeah, that's it.
I've had like a lot of people come up to me and like tell me about your channel, or I've had people also send me your videos, and they're extremely comprehensive, and like it is like reading like a paper. Like you like just I think from the titles you assume it's gonna be kind of really, and it is kind of laid back, but it's also
Uh-huh.
like you're like throwing so many references kind of like casually, and you just end up like learning a lot. It's really impressive.
Oh, thanks. That's so cool. I've like watched your channel way before mine existed, so that's really cool for me to hear.
Oh, thank you. So today we're going to talk about dating and relationships and love in general, which I think you've made a couple videos on. I've made a couple videos on. And before going into that, I would just like to say I'm like a straight dude. I've only ever been in like straight relationships. I am limited in how inclusive I can be talking about love, and in some cases I think like when we talk about like philosophy of love and stuff like that, I do think that it's trying to be somewhat universal, but at the same time I welcome other perspectives, and I'm not totally educated on like other forms of relationships and stuff like that. But I think the first thing that I kind of want to bring up is in your video you talk about love being an art versus love being a sort of event, which kind of reminded me of Zizek talks about how we conceptualize love as this thing that like happens to us. Like we're just kind of going about our day and then we like fall into it. And this is a common kind of critique of like contemporary views on love, is that it's like this passive thing that we'll just somehow like get into. And it's romantic because it kind of makes it feel like we're part of something larger, and there's like we don't really have a say almost. But I think, and we'll talk about this probably, but it's probably not super sustainable when it comes to the actual like relationship part and when there's actually effort required. But I guess what is your view on this?
Yeah, so in my video, I said that love is an art because, I also agree that this idea of love being something passive, like something that you just like fall into, something that just like suddenly comes to you, is just like, I guess like a wrong way of looking at love, because then it kind of gives you this idea that like, oh, if it doesn't work out with someone, it just wasn't meant to be, and there was like nothing you could have done about it. Or, oh, you know what? The one is like out there and I just have to wait for them to come for me. I don't really have to put as much effort in myself or my actions to go out and like bring that love into my life. And I think it's not only like a wrong portrayal of love, but I think it just does yourself a disservice. Like, you could be experiencing so much more love if you took on a more active role in regards to it.
It reminds me of, I think I have like a lot of friends that, or just people I know, that they seem to be consistently in and out of relationships. And it's usually whenever there is some sort of, either like a sort of larger, they have to commit to something all of a sudden, like they get like a dog together, or like they're thinking of getting a dog together, they might move in together, or, one of them has to go off to university, the other one stays, where it's like a very quick like abandonment. And I guess it's, and I've had people talk to me about this when it comes to my relationships and I'm having like issues, is it's kind of like, oh, you're too young to be having to deal with all this distress and stuff. It's like easier to just like let it be and just like move on. And I think it's like useful in the sense where relationships can be kind of bad, to the point where you're kind of holding on to something that, this is like taking a lot out of you, and is it really worth it? But I think more often than not, we see the other extreme, which is any sort of insecurity or conflict just really quickly leads to just they're not the one for me. Yeah.
There was this interesting comment on my video. I remember someone pointed out that like 99% of movies and films that we are shown always focus on like the process of falling in love. But then the movie kind of like ends once the love interests have like come together. It doesn't really like ever focus on what happens afterwards. Like, does this happily ever after continue? What's the process of like continuing to stay in a relationship look like? And there's also just like a bigger, I think, emphasis on like high schoolers or just like teenagers in love. Like, there's this whole thing of like adults playing teenagers in film and TV shows, right? And so obviously like relationships when you're like a teenager is going to be different from when you're like grown up a little bit. But adults are still watching like Euphoria.
Yeah, Euphoria is like probably one of like the worst examples of like healthy relationships.
Yeah.
Like definitely not a model for it. That's a really good point. And I think if you look at the fact that the often cited statistic of 50% of marriages end in divorce, you can translate that to most of the relationships we see in those movies where it ends, and probably 50% of them wouldn't realistically work out. It's you're right. Like, and it is because I think we've heavily romanticized the process of finding love and love happening to us. And no one really wants to watch a movie of like two people working things out and having like a healthy relationship, because that is boring, and storytelling usually revolves around some sort of conflict. And
yeah. And I think that just like relates to like the hyper reality part I talked about, where I think so many of us try to like copy what we see in movies, and there's just like this general trend of like attention spans just becoming like shorter and shorter, and us, I guess, wanting to care about things only if it's like passionate or like attention grabbing. I'm gonna blame a lot on like TikTok and stuff. Because I personally, like, I will admit, like, getting on TikTok, I think has, like, affected my own attention span and ability to, like, do things without, like, a YouTube video playing in the background. And I really hate that, because it kind of, like, wires your brain to just, like, seek out constant, like, stimulation in other areas of life as well.
Well, it's so toxic in the sense that, like, in the context of like relationships especially, but also just anything in general, because how the algorithm works is this minimal attention span. It's kind of like hoping that what you're seeing, you're going to agree with or be interested in like 7 seconds or less.
Yeah.
And the problem is like that, like I kind of think of it as it's almost like a different self than how we present ourselves in the real world. It's like this algorithmic self that's like, it's very kind of just within 7 seconds, it just has these desires and stuff that it doesn't really think about. And you're like shown like a video of, I don't know, like a thirst trap or an opinion that you kind of agree with in the sort of primal level. But once you start thinking about it, you go, that's kind of selfish. Like, that's not really, but you immediately agree with it. And the algorithm doesn't, like TikTok doesn't work where you need to really engage with the post. You just need to kind of watch it. And then it will keep showing you stuff like that. So you end up in this sort of like solipsistic cycle, and it really like snowballs. And then your entire feed is just all these people that, you've never met. They don't know you, and they're basically telling you you're right about things and you should feel insecure about these things, and you're of course agreeing because it's like feeding into this stuff that like this confirmation bias. And it gets really toxic, and especially in a relationship where two people need to be accountable for their own actions and the actions of the other person. It's like boundaries completely break down. It's really just like us versus them, like me versus my partner. It's really bad. Like, I don't think it helps relationships like at all.
Yeah, I'm sure too. Like, I can't remember like specific videos now, but I'm sure I've come across like at least 1 or 2 TikToks that pop up, and it'll just like arouse an insecurity that I didn't know I should even be aware of. Like, it'll be like, oh, you know, like if your boyfriend does this, then clearly he's like unfaithful. And then it'll just make all these like people who never previously had a problem with that suddenly feel like they should have a problem with it, because here's this person like passionately telling them that there is a problem with it, and it's like, well, why should I disagree with it if like 200k people like this video?
Well, yeah, and that's like, I almost feel like the end result of this is like a very boring society where everyone just likes the same things, because like for guys, it's this trend of like, this gives me like an ick, where it's like if a guy does like any sort of, I mean, some of them are kind of funny. One of them is like a guy like hyping up people, like telling them to film him because he's going to dive into the pool, but he ended up diving into like the shallow end of the pool, and then he tries to play it off, and they're like, this is like a new ick I found. And like, it's like funny, but it's also sometimes it's just stuff where it's like a guy like is just interested in something, or like they're very kind of just innocent things that maybe you don't like, and it's like a personal preference. And then a lot of people like that, and you're right, it's like 200,000 people's personal preference like against this one thing. And so all these like little kind of quirks people have, if they're really affected by social media, they're going to kind of stop doing that. They're going to become less of themselves. Like they're going to, and just, I think over time you just end up with like a sort of reduction in personality variation. Like you end up in like a more boring population because everyone's just kind of into the same trends and the same kind of culture. And then that in itself, once enough people are interested in the same thing, that becomes lame. So it's this constant cycle, and it's being like sped up even more and more and more. I guess this isn't really about relationships, but it's like once again, I'm like kind of just talking about like how TikTok I feel like it has like some of the worst consequences out of like almost any social media platform, except for, I mean, I think Facebook is probably still up there. But, yeah.
I think it's still related to relationships. Like, you know, yeah, like with people wanting to all kind of like become the same, have the same like preferences and stuff, it just like creates a more and more like standardized version of like what is a good partner. And sometimes like if we want to go into like the genders, like, oh, what is a good like boyfriend? What is a good girlfriend? What is a good like, you know, partner for a specific type of person, and it's like, oh, if my boyfriend isn't like this specific type of boyfriend, then he's not like the ideal. And I think that yeah, I don't think that's like obviously plausible or realistic if everyone actually has different preferences, different lifestyles, etc.
I think it almost like dehumanizes like your partner, your love interest, because you're like, yeah, you're like comparing them to what you said, like the ideal, like the imaginary. And it's without any sort of context of their own personality, their own sort of like your own relationship. You're getting this information from people that don't know you, and from videos that aren't necessarily made specifically for you, but just for like, you know, people trying to get famous on TikTok usually, and they're trying to like cater to the widest audience. Like there is this sort of like, and I think this goes way before TikTok, and I think it also maybe, I think it feeds into the sort of passive love we're talking about, to kind of bring it back, that we kind of use love sometimes and relationships, and also sometimes hookup culture, but just other people in general, to kind of give ourselves like this idea that we're part of something larger, this sort of ideal. And in doing so, we kind of take away like the humanity from the partner or from the other person, the love interest. Like, and I think this might be one of the main issues in relationships. Like, and yeah, I think it's you're not like authentically seeing the other person as they are. You're comparing them to this ideal.
Yeah. Have you ever like heard about like Sartre's ideas on love and things like that?
I know Beauvoir's, but I do not know Sartre's like philosophy of love very well.
Okay, well, I think there's like definitely overlap between them. But yeah, like I think his philosophy on love plays a big role in explaining also our desire for like passively engaging in love, because he talks about how like through like the look of other people and through like the gaze of others in a romantic relationship, like they're able to convert value onto us. And like, you know, it feels comfortable in this position because then we don't have to face like the responsibility of defining ourselves. We don't have to like engage with our like, what's it called? With our unlimited freedom, as the existentialists always talk about. And so, I know this happens a lot more for like women, especially in like gender norms, because a lot of like girls, when they're raised, they're always like told that like to be loved is one of the most important goals in their life. Like I know when I'm a little girl and I was like watching Disney films, other TV shows, like the girls are always daydreaming about like finding a boyfriend, about finding like a love interest in the future, and that seems to be like the overarching goal of their life. So I think like women in particular just want to have a partner define and place value on their existence for them rather than doing it themselves.
This is an extremely good point, and I've been reading Bell Hooks. She wrote Communion, The Female Search for Love, which has more to do with like older women's kind of ideas of love. And she says, as females in a patriarchal culture, we were not slaves of love. Most of us were and are slaves of longing, yearning for a master who will set us free and claim us because we cannot claim ourselves. So she thinks that she still values love, and she's completely for love. It's that love has been misplaced with this patriarchal approval. And this is very similar to, to expand it a little bit beyond this. And I think this is still with reference to the fact that I think women have the shortest end of the stick in this matter. Like this is, and it's very explicit with this issue, and this sort of like, they're kind of forced and socialized into trying to find approval, and this approval is seen as love. And I think this also extends in general because Ernest Becker, he talks about in The Denial of Death that we're all kind of, all of culture basically stems from a sort of distraction or attempt to surmount our deaths in some way. And in religious matters, we were able to kind of quell this to some extent because we could have a God. And religion works really well because he believed that there were two kind of existential motives. There were the desire for us to be ourselves and to be unique and individuated and to be kind of heroes. But then also we have this other desire that clashes with the first one, and that's the desire to belong to something larger than oneself and to kind of be one with the universe, one with the cosmos. And these clash, like they don't perfectly work with each other. But religion is one example that for a long period of history, people could kind of say like, oh, God loves me uniquely for me, and also I'm attached to his greater plan.
Right.
And that was kind of a nice answer. But then his argument is that with secularism, we kind of needed a replacement for that because we don't want, as Sartre was talking about, this sort of existential freedom, this like responsibility of freedom. Because with that comes like an awareness of death, and like we're just here for a short time and nothing really matters. So he argues that for a lot of us, we kind of felt that we could find this answer in this paradox of wanting to be oneself uniquely and also being part of something else in a partner, like in a romantic partner. And the byproduct of this is you end up kind of creating this partner that is supposed to give you a sense of approval and a sense of value and worth and almost a morality. And the problem is that you're, and this goes back to what I was talking about before, is that you're not seeing the partner as this human or this literally like a companion to your journey through life. You're seeing them as this God, as this like arbiter of goodness for you. And so you completely lose your boundaries, you lose your personality. And I think that Hooks is specifically talking about this when it comes to patriarchal culture, that man has kind of situated himself as the approver of women. And you just see that through just pop culture in general. And women especially have lost autonomy in this regard. And I think you also just see it fundamentally how romantic relationships are portrayed is this passive object, this passive person that you have to go to, and they give you something, they unlock something in you, and you're not seeing them as a person. When I read that, I thought that was, this seems to be a reoccurring thing that most people that think a lot about love, like, come to the conclusion that this is the problem.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that like paradox that you talked about, it kind of like is, I think it kind of resembles like Sartre's talking about like in love, like you have this desire for your partner to be free because you don't want them to like love you because they have to, right? But at the same time, you don't want them to be too free because then they could like technically leave you at any point, and that's a scary thought. And so it's like on the one hand, you want them to never leave, always be there. It's like this safe person, like I guess a God that's going to be unconditionally there. But at the same time, you also want them to be an individual agent and let you also be an individual agent. And there's just this like weird paradox of like how free you want your partner to be. What was the I forgot the second part I was going to talk about, but it was something related to the second part of your discussion, I think.
Oh, I mean, first of all, yeah, that's a very interesting kind of commonality that I think. Yeah, I think that it reminds me of, I'm reading this book that I think it's called like Sex After Dawn or something, and it's these psychologists just talking about kind of the evolutionary history of sex, and just the fact that it really is a struggle of monogamy and polygamy throughout human history. It's extremely paradoxical. It's extremely frustrating, especially compared to other animals that just seem to be incredibly comfortable with monogamy, like a lot of other, or comfortable with polygamy, like a lot of other apes. And and then also at the same time, a lot of our kind of conceptions of like why we're monogamous doesn't really hold weight in an evolutionary sense, like going back to like patriarchal issues, the whole idea that women want a man who will provide them with a lot of resources. That makes sense in the society that we live in, but until you look at the fact that up until agricultural times, men and women had a fairly fair share of the resources, that there was a specific cultural and social shift where men allocated most of the resources to themselves. So this is less of like a biological thing and more of like a social thing. And so they're really trying to break down those sort of problems. And yeah, one of them is kind of, why do we want our partner to be really free, but then we also just want them for ourselves? And why do they feel the same towards us? And the other thing I was talking about was the not seeing your partner as like as a person.
Right.
That I think that was the other main main point.
Yeah, I've heard things about how like, because like in existentialist philosophy, right, like you're either like the subject or you're like the object, and it's always like this relationship in terms of like consciousness. And like in love, it's like in order to have like your partner be a subject and you're seeing yourself through like their eyes, you kind of like want to just believe that they are this absolute subject that can't do really any wrong or like have like wrong perceptions about you. Because like if they're wrong, well then maybe you don't have as much value as you think they're conferring onto you. And I think that's kind of like them taking the place of like a god who will just like for sure give you like love and make sure that love means that you have some sort of value. I thought it was really interesting, your point about polygamy, because I watched this one video before, and I don't know how accurate it is because I'm not a biologist, but the person in the interview was someone who studied like neuroscience or something, and she was answering questions on love. And one of the questions was, can a partner cheat and still love you? And her answer was, yes, 100%. Sexual attraction and just like sexual activity is very different from like the emotional aspects of your brain, and someone driven by like the sexual aspect of their brain does not mean at all that an emotional aspect was included. And that was just like extreme like dissonance with like what I've always heard or what I've always thought, because I know that like, you know, if your partner goes and has like sex with someone else, it hurts really bad. And I think we've just placed like so much value and importance on like what sex means in relationships that it's really hard to separate the two. And I don't know if we ever will, at least in the near future.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very touchy subject, and everyone has their own kind of personal preferences with regards to where they like side on this. And it is cheating is like, as cheaters are basically viewed in Western societies, at least, it's like you're like dead, like you're like that's like not a cool thing to do. And like I agree, like that's because I think that there's like an understanding of the animal side and the person being really like intimate, but then also the realness and the meaningfulness behind the relationship. I think most people would argue that should, if you had a partner that was that it had some sort of value, that should kind of supersede the kind of animal drives. But yeah, at the same time, like, as a human, you understand just how powerful like sexual urges can be and how complicated it can be. And Becker also talks about it in The Denial of Death, that sex is one of these things that, like, he sees people as both, like, it's another paradox where we are both biological and we're very limited and we're going to die, and we have like we poop, we fart, we do a lot of gross things we're not very proud of. And then at the same time, we're symbolic and cultural, and we have this like infinite potential, and we can build amazing things and create beautiful art, and we can live long past our deaths in the culture. And this is like a paradox that's really hard to reconcile, but some people try to do it through, there's religion, of course, there's other cultural systems. Some people try to do it through sex, because sex, it feels transcendent. It feels almost spiritual and like above and beyond normal experience. But at the same time, it's very animal, and it reminds you of your own sort of like fatalism. And he says that this is kind of a dead end, that it's not really as much of an answer as it is just a representation of the paradox at its most ideal. But he does say, and I thought this was very interesting, that like sex with love is kind of another story, because it's basically a promise that two people make that you can both engage in this sort of dirty, fatalistic, deterministic, biological thing that you don't really have control over, with the promise and trust that you don't lose each other's sort of respect and integrity for each other as people, and you can come out of it at the end kind of unchanged, and if anything, a little bit more like actualized and a little bit more respected and dignified. And you can see that's why, you know, the sex life is so important in like a married couple and just in relationships in general. Like that's the other thing is I think that nowadays we have lost a sort of dignity when it comes to sex. And I don't want to sound like a super conservative like person, but like it's like but yeah, like I do think that, going back to TikTok, it's like another thing where I'm like, I mean, you see that comment is like people are way too comfortable on it, like sometimes, where it's like, damn, like this is a very I guess it's fully engaging with like the animal side, and I guess it's another thing, maybe it comes down to preference. I don't know what you have to think about that.
No, I totally agree with the paradox you talked about, in how sex can be both this like animal thing, but in a relationship it helps you actually maybe like transcend and like self-actualize and stuff. I'm just like wondering how to separate sex from romantic love, but also in a way that doesn't completely separate them to the point where it's like, okay, now you can cheat on your partner if it's just sex. Because, you know, asexual people do exist, and I think a lot of asexual representation is like, if you don't like sex, then there must be something wrong with you. If you don't enjoy it, then you also can't love. Like, I know a lot of asexuality is automatically linked to aromanticism, which is just not true. Like, there are asexuals who do want romantic relationships. It's just that they don't see sex as something connected to that. And there can be aromantics who want sex but don't want love. So yeah, it's like, it's hard to like think about how to separate them in a way where I guess like sex is not necessary for love, but you shouldn't break that if it is part of your relationship.
Do you think that it almost is like kind of like the ideal form of like a friendship, like a very intimate kind of just friendship between two people? Because you know, when you hang out with your friends, I feel like I'm at least like, I feel cared for, and I feel like there's some affection in some way. Like it's and of course, when it comes to like dudes hanging out with dudes, there's like a lot of gender stigmas around talking about your male friends in a way that's kind of endearing and affectionate. But you do feel like good, and you look forward to seeing them, and there isn't a sexual component to it. But it is very fulfilling and satisfying. And it just, I don't know if you've seen Arrested Development, but it
Oh
reminds
yes,
me
I
of,
love that show.
yeah, there's the two magicians, like Joe, and I forget the other one, but they're like enemies, but then they start becoming friends.
Oh my god, that
but they,
scene,
yeah.
hilarious.
Yeah, when they finally, I don't
Yeah.
know if it's a spoiler, but
Yeah.
but they because neither of them have experienced real friendship before, they think that they're gay and they're falling in love with each
Yeah.
other. And I just think it's so funny on like multiple levels. But it's kind of like what I'm talking about here. Is that I do think that there is this sort of affection and respect for the other person, that can be separated from sex.
There's actually this like short paper called Can Lovers Be Friends or something like that by Conlin, like someone called Conlin. It like really just talks about that, which is like, a lot of people always talk about how their partner, like their romantic partner, is their best friend. And this guy Conlin is like, no, actually, you can't just like combine these different types of like relationships, because it's not like this ladder where, okay, we're friends, now we're moving on to the next level, like partners. And he's like saying that, for example, let's say you're colleagues with someone. There's like a certain type of relationship you have if that person is like just your colleague. But if your friend enters the workplace and becomes your colleague, you can't really be a colleague with your friend the same way you can be with other colleagues. For example, with your friend, you might now feel the urge to like gossip more about what's going on. You might find it harder to be professional because you have a certain level of comfort that kind of isn't like compatible with like the colleague type of friendship. And he says like it's a similar type of discrepancy between like friendship and romantic relationship. I remember he gave this analogy where like friends, you see the world like side by side. So it's like you like to experience the world together, but you're kind of still like experiencing it like through your own eyes, just like with someone else that you really enjoy and like to talk about things with. But for like a lover, you see the world through each other. It's like the experience becomes even more beautiful because you're seeing the person you love, in addition to whatever else you're experiencing. And yeah, I don't know, like, I think like Conlin, the person writing this paper, brought up like some really interesting points. But I don't know if I'm like entirely convinced that friendship is like completely incompatible with romantic relationships. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, because I guess probably the hesitance there is because you see that on a lot of those like alpha male daily podcasts and stuff, where it's like guys and girls can't be friends, and it's like very kind of anytime there's like strict, people are saying there's very strict boundaries regarding any relationship, it's like a little bit questionable. And I do also think that like going back to Sartre and Beauvoir, like they had sort of a romantic friendship their whole life, where
Right.
they slept with other people, they really respected each other's like space, like to an extreme degree, where they wouldn't see each other for long periods of time, but they loved each other, they wrote love letters, they were infatuated with each other. Mm-hmm. And whenever you bring up one of them, you always remember the other one. Like they live in like a sort of cultural legacy of, no, they were like a strong couple in a weird way. So, because that is, it feels like I would almost call it like a romantic friendship. Like it feels like Beauvoir was very much of the opinion that love should neither be this sort of like absolute narcissism where you're using another person to make you feel better, nor should it be this absolute devotion where, once again, you're using the other person to make you feel better, but it's through this admiration of the other person that you're extracting some value. That it should really kind of be in the middle, where you like yourself, you understand your boundaries, you appreciate who you are, and it's the same, you feel the same way about them. And because of that, you would, like any good existentialist, respect each other's freedoms and respect each other's paths in life. no matter where that is, and no matter if it really infringes upon yours. And it's tricky. I'm assuming it's a very tricky balance, but I don't think it, I think it's possible for some people where they could be friends with their romantic partners. But I think that it probably, going back to Eric Fromm, involves that sort of art of loving. It involves a great deal of effort and understanding, and almost somewhat more of a commitment, because you've now broken down all of the artificial boundaries of, we are together now, you can't cheat. We are together now, you can't do this and do that. It's you're allowed to do whatever. So it's more so, what are you comfortable with doing, like, for yourself? And in that way, you're kind of speaking to how much you care about the other person.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess it's probably possible. Like, it's most things when we talk about relationships, it's probably possible for some people, probably not for other people. But yeah, I guess the absolutist, like, language that he's using is a little bit, I too would be a little bit questioning, a little bit skeptical of it.
Yeah. And Sartre thought that love was a failed project, so there's also that.
One of the things you brought up that I thought was interesting, and we have kind of touched on it a little bit, but proper loving as being counterculture. So I guess, like, in reference to all of the things we've been talking about, why do we not see that many representations of healthy relationships nowadays? That it seems almost like against the grain to see love as a sort of effortful act, or to, in not the cliche sense, but to actually try to figure yourself out and try to love yourself or come to terms with yourself before putting that sort of burden on another person.
Yeah. Well, I think you kind of, like, touched on it when you were talking about romantic friendship and just, like, love as an art previously, because I guess the way that love is defined right now is very much in a romantic lens. I even said it before, like, I referred to a loving relationship as, like, romantic relationship, because romanticism is kind of like the lens that we view love through, which is very much, like, full of beautiful emotions, an ideal relationship where you feel positive all the time, and this other person is supposed to, like, complete you, like your other half. It actually stems all the way back to this guy called, I'm gonna pronounce his name so wrong, but it was like Aristophanes. I think that was what it was.
I
right?
think you killed it.
Symposium on Love, Aristophanes. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Hopefully I got that right. Yeah. He was talking about, like, love is like finding your other half. And so I think maybe it's not even like the romanticism movement to blame, but just like this innate desire to want to feel complete. And perhaps another person is the way to do that, or at least we think. And so that makes it really hard to, like, think that you can achieve this level of completeness by yourself without someone else. And I think it doesn't help that, like, to do things alone is not really, it's, like, kind of looked down on. Like, people are bullied for, like, being loners. If you go eat at a restaurant alone, people look at you in pity. I think there's still very much it's not normalized, I guess, to want to spend a lot of time alone.
I think that's also, and maybe this is a bit of a radical departure from it, but the sort of, at the most innocent, the kind of Sigma male idea of, like, a guy that just doesn't even care about, like, women at all and is completely alone, which is, like, it's like a little bit, I don't, like, I find it funny, but it's like it could potentially be toxic, because it also is so close to other very toxic kind of incel, like, communities, and, like, valuing people like the Joker or kind of those loners and outcasts. It's almost like a radical response to this sort of social disapproval of just being okay with yourself, which I think is, like, I think both of us are trying to get at, is that it's just try to be okay with yourself. Like, you don't have to, like, completely live like a hermit. You don't have to be like against society, or like but it's I guess it's just interesting when there's ambiguous topics like relationships and romance, how society only seems to adjust to these things through extremes, where it's like being completely romantic, and then no, you have to be completely alone, and you have to like work on yourself. And sometimes you take it even to the extreme where you're going to be alone forever, and actually like you hate everyone, and it can be very nihilistic. And I think that sort of social disapproval, once again, that you see on TikTok is kind of already adding a lot of weight and obstacles to this process that a lot of people already don't want to do, which is basically to be alone with yourself, to figure out like where your value comes from, where your sort of sense of peace or like love with yourself comes from, which is already a hard task. And why do you think those obstacles are there? Why do you think there's like a kind of this social rejection of doing that, or at least maybe an artificial approval of doing that, but nobody like really wants you to do that? Like,
of like being alone?
Yeah, of kind of like of being alone, of not engaging with other people.
Yeah. Well, I think that I think that for some people it's an even bigger stigma than others. Like, you know, if a conventionally attractive person wants to like spend some time alone, I think they're still perceived very differently from, say, like someone who is not conventionally attractive and they're like, I just prefer to be alone. Like, people think that like this conventionally attractive person is just choosing not to get into a relationship. It's like, oh, you could have anyone you want on this like market of like people to date, but like you're making that choice not to. And like, yeah, that's confidence. That's like girl boss behavior. But then someone who's like not conventionally attractive, if they're like, you know what, I kind of just like want to focus on myself right now, trying to like focus on self-love, I think like a lot more people will perceive them as being someone who just has no game. Like, oh, you just can't get someone. And I think that's also really toxic. I just kind of hate like how much emphasis has been placed on like physical attractiveness in like relationships nowadays. And it really breaks my heart so many times when I see like couples online where one partner, especially the girl, might be like bigger than the guy, or one partner is like not as attractive as the other, and the comments will just be like, oh, they must definitely have lots of money, or oh, this is like a scheme, or like, oh, leak your secret, what is the secret?
Well, didn't you, in your video, you had like I think you had an example of a couple where the man was like, he had a disability, and and the woman was conventionally attractive, and it was a lot of like hate comments.
It's really hard, I guess. And on the one hand, I kind of understand where these reactions come from, because obviously, like, anytime you see something out of like the conventions, then, you know, you're gonna get like surprised, maybe like ask questions. But I think like it also just kind of comes from like the way that relationships are framed as, I think, as I said in my video, like a bargain. Like, you're trying to find someone who hits certain levels the highest as they can for someone like you. It's kind of like a game where you're thinking about the status of people. And it's like, how can I get like the highest status person in relation to what my status is?
Yeah, no, it is. It kind of gamifies dating. And I think also like with online dating, especially, like, there is, the way that it's set up is that it's literally, you are a product and you're marketing yourself. Like, it's literally how like an item would work when you're like online shopping, which is kind of messed up. Like, there's like a series of images of you at your best. They're not necessarily like representative of who you actually are, and no like series of 4 images is going to be representative of who you are, but it's like you at your absolute best, or at least what you think is your absolute best. And then like a short, basically, product description, which is the bio. And it's just really like demeaning kind of to yourself to have to do that. And so I think that's why you see the cycle of, at least I know a lot of my friends, they go through that, like going on dating apps and then deleting the dating apps and then being like, I'm just gonna work on myself, and then like, and they're like, no, I'm gonna go on dating apps again, and it's like over and over and over again. And it's because it is bad for your self-esteem. It is like, you're not accurately portraying yourself, and you are just kind of, you're putting yourself into this little kind of item that people can decide if they want to like order or not. And how they're deciding is, more often than not, just because of the format, it's based off of what you're talking about, which is like the status. Does this person match with my status, or do they enhance my status at all? And it is really like, it's almost like going back to like medieval times, in the sense that like it's like matchmaking off of pure kind of social status and pure like not even really thinking about the potential like relationship and like romance, because it's the way that it functions is it's too limited for people to actually get that sort of information. They have to go on a date with these kind of false pretenses of who this person is going to be, and it's like flawed from the start.
Have you ever been on dating apps before?
Yes.
Okay. Yes. I'm interested, like, in your experience with that, because I've never been on one, and I don't think I ever will subject myself to it. But like, what was your experience with it?
I remember, this especially like, this was first year of university. I didn't have any dating apps, and then one of my friends got like Tinder, and he had, I think, one match in over like 4 weeks or something.
Oh wow.
And and we're all like 18, so we think that's like really funny. And then my other friend got it, and he got a couple matches, and then they like encouraged me to get it, and I ended up getting quite a few matches. And for me, it almost became a little bit like addictive, because it is just like, you just get like self-esteem boosts, and it's really fleeting. And the way people talk to each other on the app is just not good. It's like not human. Like, looking back, it was like very, I don't know, it's very artificial. And I think one of the things, because I ended up being in relationships that began from dating apps, is that there is that lingering sense the whole time of, is the fact that we met on the dating app, is that a bit of an issue? And I don't know. It shouldn't be, but I think like for me, it was always kind of staying there. Like would it have been better to meet in more genuine circumstances? And I think that also feeds back into the sort of like passive love kind of, like love is waiting out there somewhere for you. And so I don't know. I can't say like, it was super positive, but I was also, I think, a bit more of like a messy person when I was using it. So,
I see.
My memories of it probably aren't like the most like accurate or great, but I think the one feeling that I felt was like, you do feel a little bit like a lack of dignity and like self-respect when using it.
I see. Yeah, that's what I've heard, I think, from a lot of people who use it, I guess. It's just like, oh, you feel good. And I think like it's different kind of from like a girl's perspective if we're talking about like hetero relationships, because I know that like it usually is the case where the guy has to like shoot out a bunch of messages, like have to shoot out as many shots as they can, and then the girl just kind of like waits, and the girl kind of gets like the choice on like, do I reply, do I give this person attention or not? And I just think that also kind of takes away from like maybe the simultaneous nature of like what relationships should be.
Yeah, well, also, and I think for guys, the guys then forget what they want. And this is like a reoccurring conversation I've had with like male friends, which is like, okay, that's great, she said yes, but like, are you actually interested in this person? Like, I think that it's the pursuit of and attempting to like attain their interest like supersedes their own sort of expectations and their own needs. And then what ends up happening is, like, let's say they get into a relationship for a while, is that all of this kind of bubbles up to the surface, and it can be really bad overall in the relationship. And you end up with kind of a toxic situation because, like, their needs aren't being met. They don't know how to communicate them because they're kind of this, like what you say, like they're kind of like expected to kind of keep the like girl's attention, to kind of do what the girl wants. And you can kind of lose yourself. And I think it goes back once again to like this need to actually understand yourself before you decide to pursue a relationship, to understand your boundaries, to have a sort of peace of mind and like clarity about what you actually want and what you're comfortable with.
Yeah, for sure. Do you think that people can come to this place of understanding their boundaries and understanding what they want without a trial of like messy relationships before getting there? Or do you think like it's kind of necessary to go through a few like bad relationships or just like relationships that don't work out in order to get there? Sorry, I'm like interviewing you now.
Oh no, it's okay. I mean, it's like, it's not really supposed to be an interview. I think it starts out like that, and then I think it gets more natural, and then it becomes more of like a conversation, which is that's ideal. But yeah, I don't know. That's a really good question, because I don't believe in the idea that you need to suffer in order to grow in some sense. Like, I think that that's kind of like a Puritan sort of like old age, like, you know, like pain is there when it comes to development and stuff, but you shouldn't actively subject yourself to negative relationships in order to like do better or become a better person. I think that's like kind of a little bit insane. But it definitely, like, it's like if you ever read, like, especially when it comes to like philosophy, you basically are reading a lot of the same, especially when it comes to love, like the topic of love. You're reading kind of the same ideas in different language, like over and over again. Sometimes there's disagreements, but I think especially with this topic, you see a lot of the same thing come up, because it's like, it's this kind of ambivalent, strange topic that people have wondered about throughout history. And the problem is because you keep seeing it over and over again, and then you see it kind of like disassembled into like culture cliches, like work on yourself and love yourself and communication is key. Like, you hear these things, and it's the equivalent of your parents like saying the same stuff over and over again, and you're like, okay. But it's until you actually realize why those things have any sort of meaning, is like, then it makes sense. There's a, like, on this topic, little bit of a departure, but I think this comes to just life in general. But I don't know if you've ever seen Darjeeling Limited by Wes Anderson.
I don't think I have.
It's three brothers that they go to India with the idea of they're going to like find themselves and like grow and stuff like that. And it's a critique of like kind of Orientalism and how the West kind of treats India, because they get there and India doesn't give a shit about them, and they end up having an awful trip. Like, because India isn't to serve this purpose of making them like, it's not like this manic pixie dream girl that's going to make them feel better. They actually have to go through their own uncomfortable stuff, and they have to go through the death of this child, and then they end up meeting their mother, and who kind of abandons them. And at the very start, the main brother is very adamant that they do this ritual that he bought from this guy that definitely just like ripped them off at this like market in India, that like, oh, we do this ritual, we'll end up actually feeling more connected, we have to go to the top of this mountain. And they do it at the start, and they're bickering and they're like complaining and stuff, and obviously it doesn't like it doesn't do anything, and they completely fall apart. And then it's only after this entire movie where they actually have to like realize that all they have is each other, and that they do have to kind of relinquish some of the baggage, and the actual moments of morality don't actually happen like in India. Like, there's a lot of kind of flashbacks, and and then they do the ritual at the end of the movie, and there's kind of a sense of like there's a symbolic shot of them like throwing away their suitcases as they like board the train. It's their dad's suitcases who had like passed away, and a lot of it was kind of getting past their dad. But I think that that's such a genius way to just describe the pursuit of wisdom in general, in that we don't do these rituals and entertain these cliches in order to get something out of them. We have to like go and do the work, and only then can we actually see and accept and embrace like the purpose of the ritual and like the essence of the cliches. Like that's why you can be surrounded by all the knowledge in the world, but it's like you do kind of have to live in order to like to really understand the meaning behind it all.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, I think there definitely is something that comes from just experiencing something. It's very different from being like, okay, this is what I think and I've been told. I remember in high school, I was like talking to one of my teachers at the time, and he was just like asking me what was up, and I was like, oh yeah, like there's this whole drama going on with like one of my friends having like trouble with like her boyfriend, and she was like asking me for advice, and he just kind of like chuckled, and he was like, oh, asking you for advice? Yeah, high schoolers asking other high schoolers for advice about like relationships. And at the time I was like, oh, okay, Mr. Cynical. But like now looking back, I'm like, he had a point, because at the time it's not like I had ever been in a relationship before. And I was just kind of telling my friend advice from like stories I hear from other people, or films I've seen, or just like like mottos like communication is key. But it gets different when you actually get into a relationship. And I think you kind of like truly figure out the complexities of a relationship once you've been in one for a while. Like just even the fact of like getting used to arguments and them being something that will exist in relationships, and that arguments don't mean your relationship is now over. Like when I was younger, I used to think that every time my parents fought, it meant they were getting a divorce. And that was just because like all the books I read, all the movies I watched, like if a couple fought really bad, it usually meant that they weren't meant to be. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's exactly dead on. It's hard because you don't want to give the advice of, oh, you should like entertain really toxic, awful relationships to learn about love. That's, it's not healthy, but also naturally in life, you will end up in, if you really decide to like engage with life, you will end up in relationships that will probably be challenging and have conflict in them. And that just means that you're taking life seriously, and you're not like backing away, and you're taking like love as like an active term and not a passive term. And it reminds me of my dad. I don't think he came up with this quote, but he says it a lot. And he says that love and life are free, but learning that isn't. And I think it's kind of the gist of this, where it's just, like the feelings themselves, and happiness and friendship, and like those are free. You don't need anything for them in a sense. You just need another person. Sometimes you just need yourself. But to get there, requires a great deal of sacrifice and insight and kind of motivation to find some sort of like peace. And sometimes you have to surmount social expectations and obstacles that might make you feel isolated, might make you feel rejected, might make you feel stupid. But if you believe those things are like worth it in the end, then why not like at least try?
Yeah, I totally agree with that.
Yeah, I was just gonna ask if you have anything else to add regarding love and relationships, and besides that, I think I mean, I don't think we've solved anything necessarily, but I think we had a really good talk.
Yeah, no, I don't think I'm providing solutions to one of the biggest problems that like everyone faces and thinks about anytime soon. But it's always I think it's always important to like think about, because I think love truly is so like central, and should be treated with more respect.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. Thank you for coming on the podcast. And I remember your name, but your YouTube name it's
Ollie Sun Via. It's like my last name, Sun, in between my name, Ollie and Via.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's easier to remember. Okay, check out Ollie Sun Via. It's really great channel, very insightful. She talks about a lot of the same topics I do. And yeah, thank you again.
Thank you.